Welcome to the Journal of Biophilic Design podcast. Well, welcome to the Journal of Biophilic Design. We're joined today by Neil Usher. He's Chief Workplace and Change Strategist at GoSpace AI. He's been working with complex change problems for over 40 years, and he's a sought-after conference and academic speaker. His new book's really timely and important right now as workplace and employees continue to roll around in this period of change and uncertainty. There's the book, Elemental Change: Making Stuff Happen When Nothing Stands Still. I suggest you all get yourself a copy. Neil, many thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much. Delighted to be here.
Great. I first met you at Workplace Trends Conference, Maggie and Nigel's bash. Can you sort of just first of all, just kick off by telling us about yourself, how you come to do what you do, what your journey's been?
Gosh, the journey was entirely unplanned, but by the same token, it seemed to be planned at every step that I took, if you see what I mean. But I've been in the business of property, corporate real estate, workplace now for approaching 30 years. I did a master's degree in IT, believe it or not, in 1990, 91. And sort of fell into facilities management by accident, loved it, and sort of grew my career from there. So every step of the way has really been sort of mainly on the occupier side. I spent most of my time on the occupier side, looking at sort of broader portfolios, more of that sort of journey on a sort of in a anti-clockwise direction around the property clock, starting with FM, moving into capital projects, workplace design, transaction management. And then into sort of global and regional property strategy. Last couple of years, I've been with GoSpace AI, which is the first artificial intelligence application for dynamic workplace planning, which has been fascinating as well. But yes, I've sort of made property and workplace my home really for almost 30 years.
That's great, thanks. I've talked to you separately about the GoSpace AI. I'm quite interested in that. Your book, Elemental Change, has this terrific title, Making Stuff Happen When Nothing Stands Still. Obviously, with this COVID and lockdown, I think a lot of people have been thinking nothing's happened, it's all standing still. But actually, there's so many goalposts that have been moved, and sort of emotionally, socially, and obviously, especially in terms of the workplace, or where we can conceive our workplace to be. I mean, what are you seeing in the workplace? I mean, how are people coping, and sort of what do you think of the main issues are that people are struggling with in terms of change?
What was interesting was I was talking to a friend of mine who's in Milan yesterday.
Yeah.
You may remember in the early days of the lockdowns in Italy, people were sort of playing and singing opera from the balconies, and there was this wonderful sort of spirit of look, this is really unusual, really different, but we're going to get through this. There was a sort of indomitability about it all, really, in terms of we are going to triumph over this pandemic. And I think with the sort of succession of lockdowns and the time this has dragged on, and with vaccines on the horizon and with them starting to be rolled out, there's a sort of injection of hope into all of this. But I think we've become sort of progressively more and more exhausted by it all. The uncertainty really as to when is this going to start to sort of be pushed out of our society, and the sort of the idea somehow that we'll be returning to a normality. I'm not necessarily sure that normality is a thing in any way at all, and that really is one of the contentions of the book, with everything flowing, that actually normality is just a point in time. But I'm sort of sensing really as well within the workplace sector that it's very difficult for anyone to actually take any action. It's very difficult for anyone to plan anything because there is such a degree of uncertainty about the future. So everyone's almost sort of looking across the start line at the others, thinking, who's going to go first? Who is going to be that first mover? Who's going to do something really brave, really interesting? But I'm not, because I'm just in case. And on that basis, no one's really taking that first step. And I think that's really where we are. And then with Christmas and end of the year approaching, I think it's been a useful point for people to say, well, look, if we are going to make any moves, we're certainly not going to make them this side of the holiday. So we'll sort of have a break, come back in the new year, see how the land's lying, and see if we're going to be that first mover then.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think everybody's, as you say, waiting for someone else to kind of make that move, and Christmas is sort of coming up and putting a sort of huge stock in it, doesn't it? Really. I mean, in your book's divided into separate sort of like different parts, and in your opening gambit, your final paragraphs about collaboration, and actually one of the sort of things, your analogy of the train sets, I think, is spot on. You know, we sort of start down one track, and then another train joins, and then before we know it, we're on a completely different track, heading in a completely different direction. Obviously, when you get more people involved with things, you know, it's, you know, that obviously, you know, things happen. People have to have different ideas, or they have different things. You even mentioned about like a grieving curve, where people go up and down and up and down, and you've got sort of 3 or 4 of those all coming together. I mean, how can people cope with this? You know, how can people cope with collaborating and the change?
One of the points I make, and I probably sort of in talking about the book post publication, you know, some of the, you know, and you have to sort of be very succinct when you're doing that. So you sort of start to pull out some key points from the book, and you wonder if they've been made clearly enough in a sort of 60,000 word book. But the idea that uncertainty is our opportunity. If we think about our personal lives and we think about organizational lives, because nothing is standing still, because everything is interconnected in some way, and because sort of life, and corporate life in particular, doesn't work like it works in a lot of change books that I've read, where everything does stand still, and it's almost like a laboratory, and we can conduct these experiments and see what happens. It actually becomes very difficult to plan, and very difficult to sort of to get to the end of the journey that you've planned in that sense. So, you know, what I'm seeing really is that we need to develop a much sort of closer relationship with change. We need to understand that it's our essence. A lot of the literature as well seems to estrange us a little from change, whereas actually, because we are living, breathing change, we're actually very sort of naturally adept at coping with uncertainty. And sometimes I don't think we back ourselves enough really in that sense, and back our own sort of resourcefulness and our own ability to navigate uncertainty. And then when we look at large corporations in particular, they're sort of engines that are really designed to remove uncertainty from all of their processes and all of the environments in which they operate. And actually, by doing so, they're actually, by trying to create as much certainty as possible, they're removing the possibilities for innovation and creativity in doing so. They're actually stopping interesting things happening. So, whilst I didn't write this book during the sort of COVID era, it was all pretty much drafted and done before. I think what's relevant now really is really sort of getting across to people that the uncertainty that we're facing is actually a fantastic opportunity. It's not something necessarily to be afraid of. It's not something to try and iron out. This is something where we have to actually capture the energy of uncertainty, and this is going to enable us to do amazing things. And I think there's been some fantastic debate to follow in the whole workplace sector during this period of time. You know, people are really thinking deeply about sort of the present and the potential future, probably like never before, really. I think we had another spike of it during the last sort of global recession that we had. And I think we had some really fantastic outcomes from that in terms of the way the workplace develops. I think that period of thought really helped us. So I'm hoping that this period of time and this period of introspection makes us much more comfortable with change, makes us sort of feel like we have a confidence in dealing with change and thinking about change, and that we actually start to appreciate uncertainty and the movement of all of the parts ahead of us, because that's how we can navigate to a better world of work and a better workplace. So, not something to be afraid of. This is really all about sort of, you know, grasping the opportunities we have, understanding those opportunities, but using uncertainty to navigate.
That's really great. I think anybody listening to that, I think, should take heart and actually, yeah, embrace change. I mean, just obviously, this is the Journal of Biophilic Design, and it's all about nature, and it's about you know, how sort of nature, when we look at nature, we sort of benefit it. I mean, obviously, we see change in nature all the time. I mean, leaves fall off the tree, you know, to enable the the tree to draw in its energy during winter, and obviously roses bloom, then wilt, sort of blossoms, the blossom flowers, and then it turns into fruit, gets eaten by a squirrel, and then gets pooped out, and then becomes another tree. So, change doesn't have to be, and like you say, it doesn't have to be a negative thing, actually, and sort of like this evolution, you talk about evolution. I mean, how do you think people could use even observance of nature processes to help them realize that nothing's forever and that change happens, and it's actually often for the best, as in the case of the pooped out fruit, for instance?
When you were talking about that, I was thinking about, is it the cat that eats coffee beans, and we sort of recycle the other end and they become very expensive coffee. But yeah, I mean, I think sort of looking at nature is a fantastic way to actually consider that perpetuality really of change. It is all around us. The signals, the clues that change is the essence of our life are everywhere. I hadn't actually specifically mentioned that in the book, but now that you've mentioned it, I think it would have been a great reference in that sense, because it never stands still. And actually, one of the things that's been really fascinating during this period of not just sort of going to the station in the morning and getting into town and then coming home half the year in the dark, is actually watching the seasons and watching those changes. I've had walking the dog and things, had the luxury of actually just sort of in very similar situations around where I live, being able to see the change of the seasons in great detail, like never before, probably. Been more aware of that change than ever. And so yeah, so anybody who is in any doubt at all that change is the essence of our lives should just really go for that walk in the forest, I think.
Yeah, it's really true. I'm name checking the book again, but Elemental Change, page 49. Evolution and transformation. You talk about sort of DNA and also cells consuming another. You have obviously ancient Greek references, which I love. Thank you very much for that. An ancient reference, obviously, personally, I love this. It kind of resonates highly with me. But you talk about the gladiator versus the accountant, which made me smile. Tridents versus spreadsheets, and obviously the accountant usually wins, but that's because the initiative is like sort of wrapped up in sort of dressed up as a gladiator almost. And you also talk about transformation and companies buying another, obviously cells eating another cell kind of thing and absorbing. It's a really interesting sort of biology. And I mean, that's what I must admit, I mean, anybody who's going to, I do stress people to buy the book, because it's absolutely excellently written. It's really accessible, and it's fun as well. It's actually a fun book. You learn through the analogies that you use. Can you sort of explain maybe how transformation versus evolution, I mean, and sort of the nature of companies, can you explain how it should be, maybe it should be a process of evolution?
What's interesting is that just about every change initiative you hear about is sort of inflated into being this transformation. If it's not a transformation, it's not relevant, important, not worthy of enough attention. So we often talk about transformational change as being the one that we should take notice of. Just about every book that's been written about change since COVID, really, or published since COVID, has all been about leading transformation. So I just wanted to sort of do a little research and just familiarize myself with the sort of roots of the terms, really, in this sense. And I found it fascinating understanding that a transformation is actually when one single cell consumes another cell. Obviously, being a single cell, it doesn't particularly think about it. It just kind of does it. Yeah. And most of the time it's fatal. But that is a transformation. And on the odd occasion of all the single cells consuming other single cells, it creates something new. So really my conclusion was that sort of transformations are actually very small things. Transformations are important, but they almost just sort of puncture that timeline in a way. And that timeline itself is evolution. So transformation is not necessarily a bigger thing than evolution. So what I was really trying to stress was that evolution's probably got a bad name. It's considered to be boring, and it is the accountant and the spreadsheets. It's considered to be the stuff that just kind of rolls on. But really, what it's all about is big kind of table thumping, chest beating transformation. And actually, in reality, that's not necessarily the case. I think we need we need to sort of reappraise our understanding of what evolution is, because actually evolution it sits at the heart of this, and evolution can be fast. Doesn't I checked on this, and I think it takes about 1 million years for a sort of a fish to grow legs, in terms of evolutionary terms. So we always think about this as being something really slow and really dull, but actually evolution is something we need to understand a lot more, and probably stop using the term transformation quite as much. There is nothing wrong with saying, look, this particular change initiative is an incredibly important evolution. That's not a bad thing.
Yeah, it's true. And evolution obviously is about turning. It's about moving.
Yeah.
So, I mean, similarly, you mentioned adaptation versus adoption. Obviously, we see that all the time in nature. Sort of going back to what you said, when animals adapt to their environment. I mean, is that what you're saying here, that we should also adapt?
Yeah, adaptation is much more closely related to evolution, and most change programs in workplace, and I'm always very interested actually, and I'll reference it here in the comparison really between sort of the software and IT industry and the workplace industry, but because this is really where I first noticed the difference, but because there's usually a sort of a physical relocation, whether it's coming out or of an existing workplace for a while and then going back into the same or moving building or something, there's always a sort of a clear line. And so the change process, the leadership of the change process usually begins too late in that whole process. And so, what we're actually doing is we're sticking things on. We're actually asking people to adopt new behaviours, do something different. And it's a little bit like downloading an app onto your phone. We have a look, we decide whether we like it or not, or if it's got a use or not. Sometimes we might do that and keep it. So there's a bit of a window of opportunity there for that adopted behavior to stick, but a lot of the time we reject it. And that's why adoption-led change programs very, very rarely succeed. This idea that we'll sit you all in a room, we'll tell you what new behaviors you need, we'll tell you what the protocols are, and hope that they work. Whereas actually what this is about is allowing people to adapt. So we're allowing them to evolve, which is we give people the knowledge, the resources, we give people the information they need, and we engage with them and we get them involved in the change process such that they're changing themselves. We're not changing people, we're enabling them to change themselves. So we're enabling them to adapt. So there's, in the same way that evolution is punctured by transformations, the process of adaptation may be punctured by the adoption of certain behaviors. But actually what we want to create deep and lasting change is for people to adapt. And as I point out in the book, evolution doesn't work in reverse. It may be that something that happens in the future bears a resemblance to something that's happened in the past, but that is still in itself evolution. We don't go back to something, we evolve into that again, and other circumstances will have changed. So if we start doing something in the future that looks like something we did in the past, it won't be the same because so much else around us will have changed at the same time.
That's exactly true. I mean, obviously, I can't begin to touch on everything that you mentioned in the book, but there's one thing that I did find quite interesting in part two. Yeah, it's in part two. You've got, and I'm just going to show the screen there. So you've got this hexagon. Obviously, I love hexagons. Nature loves hexagons. Bees love hexagons, and we all love honey. I mean, I just thought this hexagon, and then how you go on to describe each element of that hexagon and how you use it and adapt to it and all this sort of thing. I just think it's brilliant. But it's not just for workplace. I think it would be really useful for people, for life, actually. The way, I mean, you can adapt everything that you said, I think, for living a better life, to be fair, and trying to help you focus on your new journey or your new thing. But can you tell us a little bit about the hexagon? I mean, maybe if you can sort of touch on the different elements.
Yeah.
Obviously, there's a lot of words that you've written in here, which I don't expect you to kind of quickly press in about 4 minutes. But yeah, if you could just touch on that, I just to give people a flavour of what it is, that'd be great. Thank you.
Cool. Yeah, the second part of the book is really all about preparing. I actually was reflecting this morning, actually walking the dog, on the fact that yes, the Cub Scout motto when I was a youngster was always be prepared, and I didn't realise at the time just how important that was really in thinking about leading change. But we always talk about planning in change terms, but actually planning is a sort of subset of one of the components of what I've created, which is an operating system of change. And you're right in the sense that it should be applicable to our own lives as much as it is to corporate life. The change isn't different the other side of the revolving door. It's the same everywhere in that sense. And the approaches can be the same and they can be commonly applied. But what I was trying to get at really with the operating system was something that enables us to be prepared for this uncertainty, because we very rarely have perfect information, because everything ahead of us and to the side of us is constantly moving, and because it's all interrelated, and navigating those paths is incredibly difficult. We need to have a framework in our minds where we're aware of as well, in terms of sort of how much of all of this we have and its interplay, to be prepared to deal with that uncertainty. If we're saying uncertainty is an opportunity is the first of those components of the operating system, then we need to have that operating system in place. And again, it's another term borrowed from software industry in that sense, because the other thing I think about operating systems is they're quite unglamorous. We get the little, notifications through update your operating system, but and we notice a few little changes, but most of what's going on with an operating system is sort of below the line in a way. We look at the applications, the things that sit on top, as being the things that are sort of interesting and glamorous, but nothing works without an operating system, nothing at all these days. Otherwise, it's just a box of wires, that's completely useless. And the Hexagon really came from, and the sort of using six came from the sort of the structure of the last book, in terms of the 6 E's of a fantastic workplace. So I thought, well, forget six for a moment, and let's just see what we think the components of an operating system of change would be, and sort of landed on six again. First of those being the opportunity. Very often we rush straight into the vision, but sort of mapping that opportunity. I think it's really important to set out, how we got here, where we are now, and where we want to head to in the future. It's more detailed than a vision statement, but actually understanding that opportunity. And we can't forget as well that it's got a time limit on it. Opportunities don't last forever. It's something that we need to action or not. And then we move into that vision. I think the vision is better positioned as a question than it ever is as a statement. And the real sort of contribution, I think, in this book is to look at sort of asking questions of people, which engages them. It makes them feel that they're part of developing the solution. And also, they sort of hijack the brain. If we ask someone a question, it's almost impossible not to try and answer it. It's very difficult to ignore a question. So we do engage people in that sense. And then we're looking at evidence, and I really focus on sort of both data and story. I think story is often underplayed. I'm seeing quite a lot of talk and writing now about the importance of sort of data stories. Data on its own needs to be captured in stories. We need to tell stories, and we need to hear them from people as well. It's important. Data gathering is listening to the stories that get told in organizations. Then leadership is an inevitable contribution, I think, in this sense. So I have a little look at leadership as distinct from management, and then looking at trust. I think trust is vital, not just on a personal level, but on a group and a team level as well, which is where I get into the sort of a deeper look really at the idea of psychological safety, which I think is sort of missing some components. And I think the term psychological safety is decades old, but we're still struggling to define it. If we've got this vital tool in corporate life that we can't actually describe, and not many people know what it is, but it is so vital, then we're missing something here. And I've sort of rechristened it, including physical safety, to be elemental safety. And then we're really looking at the resources we need for our operating system, and that can include everything from sort of the other sort of team members we need to bring in through to sort of money and administration, all the other sorts of practical things. But the plan, I talked about the difference between preparation and planning. The plan sits within the resources. It's a subset of resources. And sorry, my dog is actually drinking out of his bowl. So if you can hear a slurping noise in the background, it's not me, it's the dog over in the corner. But the resources that we need include that plan, and that plan has to be highly flexible. Soft planning, the need for soft planning rather than rigid planning. I've seen so many change initiatives struggle because people, having spent time and effort planning, rigidly adhere to this plan, and they won't deviate from it, even when they can see that the conveyor belt is heading over the cliff. No, that's the plan, we have to deliver it. And then the finger usually gets pointed at the execution of the plan later. So that's a very quick walkthrough of those 6 components of the operating system. But my contention is that these should be in place at all times. You don't bring all these things together for a change initiative. These are things that organizations and things that we as people really need to have at our disposal at all times, because we never quite know when we're going to need to draw on them. But we have to be aware of where we're at now with each one of those. And the use of the spider chart in the hexagon is quite useful for planning where we think we're at and where we need to get to. We can identify those gaps and we can do what we need to do to be as prepared as possible.
Part 3 is actions. Leading on from that, is there one action from there that you'd like to discuss a little bit more, maybe in terms of like how many leaders want, quick fixes? I mean, they always want quick fixes, but I probably want more quick fixes quicker than ever before. Obviously, the knee-jerk reactions we're seeing at the moment and cheap ones. But I mean, especially as people come back to work, I mean, is there anything that you'd like to just touch on?
I should say I do take apart the whole idea of quick wins. I call them the fast food of the change industry, and I think we overly focus on those. I won't say too much more about it as I'll spoil it. I mean, the 9 elements of change, there's a periodic table which I find a very useful sort of structure really for these things. And, again, argue in a similar way to the last book, argue that these elements need to be present in leading any change initiative. And they're in 3 groups. So I'm informed, I'm engaged, and I'm involved. And very often, as we move sort of left to right through those 3 groups, we find that change initiatives may stop just informing people. People might be told what's going to happen, but they don't get anything else. Sometimes they stop at a level of engagement, a little bit of sort of, a few emotional triggers and a little bit of sort of bringing people in. And very often, they don't include any degree of involvement at all. So involvement is the group that I think is probably the most, underrated, underdescribed, and undercommented on really in terms of our whole approach to change and the actions we'll take. But there's one sort of component, if you like, of getting people involved that I find fascinating, and it's known as tummeling. And tummelers are, if that's because it's a German word, or the root is a German word. It's actually it actually then sort of transformed into a Yiddish word, and what it means is those people at a wedding who encourage others to dance. So, whether I can actually say tummeler or tummeling, I'm not sure because of the root of the word really and the way that the word has evolved. But for the sake of the book, I'm going to do that. But a tummeler is someone who does things differently and talks about doing things differently. These aren't people who are appointed. They're not given a formal role in a project. You are the tummeler. Here's your brief. Here's your role description. You go off and do this. These are people who just are in that process of adaptation. They are seeing that there's some opportunity. They're seeing that they can actually work differently, and they're doing that very visibly, and they're talking to their colleagues about doing it as well, because they can see the benefit and they're experimenting, and they can see that there's something in this. The actual effect of tummelers is very low key, but hugely important in a project, and it's an idea that came from a friend of mine who was aware of it from a website in the US called Tumblevision TV, where they picked up on this, and really powerful. His role was as a social artist in residence at an incubator center, and his role was there really just to talk to people. They were all doing completely separate things, working on separate innovations and separate projects. But they were very aware that if everybody just sort of sat in their cabins, then there wouldn't be any kind of collaborative life to this incubator center. So his role was just to look at what people were doing, was to talk about it, talk to other people about what everyone else was doing, and to act as this sort of social conduit effectively in this space. And it was amazing to see the benefit of that. He went on a couple of trips and was away for several weeks. And in talking to him when he returned, he was sort of very aware of how people had sort of, almost retreated into their little units as a result of him not being there. But that kind of social stimulus that he gave it, that tummeling that he was involved in, is incredibly important. So I think there are things going on in change initiatives that no one ever really talks about that are actually vitally important. This is part of involvement. This is part of sort of involvement that doesn't have a particular instruction. No one's given a role. No one's told what to do. There's a lot of roles in change projects like change champions and things where people have a brief and groups that have to get together and have to do things. This is just completely voluntary activity. So actually finding out who your tummelers are, giving them the space, giving them the resources they may need to continue to tummel, I think is absolutely fascinating and is a vital component of leading change.
Now, is there anything else you'd like to add?
I think really just to reiterate, I think that we have nothing to fear from change. I think if we continually say to people over and over again that people are afraid of change, and I hear it far too many times, then we'll start to believe this. But actually, we have nothing to fear from this. I think what we really need to do is understand that change is our essence. And be very comfortable with it and understand that uncertainty is a fantastic opportunity. So I'm really optimistic about 2021. I was saying the other day, there's an old adage that if you can keep your head while all others around you are losing theirs, then you probably misunderstood the situation entirely. And that could be me, but I'm still really optimistic about next year. I think that the more we grow into dealing with uncertainty and the uncertainty of the world and the immediate environment, the more we'll start to see those opportunities. But when we see them, it's about doing something with them. It's about understanding them. It's about mapping them and bringing that into our operating system of change, deploying those elements in leading change and making amazing things happen.
Sounds good to me. And sort of obviously that we ask a question right at the end of the podcast each time, and it's always about if you could brush the world or the workplace with a brush of biophilia. I mean, in your case, I mean, what would it look like in terms of maybe improved adoption or adaptation of and implementation of change?
I mean, I've long been a fan of sort of biophilic approaches to workplace. The last major corporate project I did had 24,776 plants in the building. The reason I remember that number is because it's just so unrounded and so sort of left field. But that's how many plants we ended up putting in. I think sort of relating that to change. I think I'd like sort of biophilic designs to feel natural, and I know that sounds sort of almost sort of silly to say, but I think they look awkward when they're too contrived. I think it has to be a sort of natural feeling. It has to be quite organic. It has to have some flow. And I'm also fascinated by how we transition from external to internal environments and how that becomes as seamless as possible. There's a philosopher Deleuze who called it the fold between internal and external spaces. It's a very sort of difficult concept, and I'm not necessarily sure I entirely grasped it myself. But the danger is sometimes the sort of the external environment, the internal environment can look so different, even with the sort of biophilic approaches we apply internally. So, how can we possibly make that transition between internal and external space as seamless and as natural as possible? And because most of the natural world, even when it's curated, is still does surprising things and interesting things, we have to allow those surprising and interesting things to happen internally as well. If we've just got sort of, if we just take this as, here's some timber and here's some rigid rows of pot plants and here's a shard of light, then it's going to feel like we're forcing something. So I think really it's about making sure that it feels natural, feels organic, doesn't feel forced and doesn't feel contrived.
Thank you for listening to the Journal of Biophilic Design podcast.